The sea was quiet the morning the submarine slipped away from its harbor, its steel hull cutting through the still water like a blade through glass. To those who watched from shore, it seemed a routine departure, another silent patrol destined to vanish beneath the horizon. Yet there was something unspoken about its mission, something that made the officers exchanging salutes hold their gaze a little longer than usual. The vessel was not just a machine of war, it was a moving labyrinth of secrets, carrying lives and classified intent into depths where no sunlight reached. The submarine was built to embody resilience, its reinforced hull designed to withstand pressures that would crush lesser vessels. Inside, men settled into the rhythm of another patrol, the quiet shuffle of boots on metal grating, the constant hum of machinery, the faint vibration that reminded each of them that they were moving forward though unseen by the world above. It was a world of whispers and discipline, where routine was both shield and prison. Yet within this routine lingered the awareness that any mission at sea was a wager, and the ocean did not forgive mistakes. Naval Command had framed this operation as vital but unremarkable, just another patrol through contested waters. There had been no dramatic speeches, no announcements to stir morale. The submarine left in silence, and silence was expected until its safe return. The men on the bridge had logged the departure in precise, impersonal words, as if stripping the act of emotion could reduce its weight. But even in such clinical language, one line stood apart: awaiting transmission. It was a phrase that would later be revisited with a bitterness no one foresaw. The voyage itself began without incident. The submarine disappeared into its element, slipping below the surface where the world became only sonar pings, blinking lights, and the steady recording of depth and course. Days passed in the manner they always did: meals at regular intervals, maintenance checks, navigation recalibrations, drills that blurred the line between practice and preparation. The ocean outside remained an unknown expanse, an infinite wall pressing from all sides. Inside, life was measured in routines until a message broke that fragile equilibrium. The last transmission came unexpectedly. It was not scheduled, nor was it formatted in the usual style of structured reports. Naval Command received it in the early hours, a short burst of sound followed by a line of words that would later be studied and restudied. The content was simple, stripped of context, devoid of explanation. A phrase, a string of numbers, and then silence. There was no acknowledgement, no follow-up, no continuation of the coded sequence. It was as though the submarine had spoken once and then vanished into the deep. At first, the signal was interpreted as a technical anomaly. Perhaps interference, perhaps a truncated communication. Analysts assured one another that the vessel would report again soon, that the next scheduled transmission would clarify the matter. Hours stretched into a day and unease began to grow. Naval officers retraced the coordinates, charted the likely position, compared the timing against weather reports and sonar activity. None of it explained the abruptness of the message. The ocean remained silent. Behind closed doors, commanders debated what to tell the families. To admit uncertainty was to invite panic, but to withhold information was to plant the seeds of distrust. They chose measured language: transmission received, awaiting further contact. It was a phrase meant to reassure, but those who read between the lines understood its emptiness. Her vessel could not be both transmitting and silent. The ocean became the stage for speculation. Some believed the submarine had suffered a mechanical failure and drifted helplessly to the seafloor. Others whispered of collisions, of sudden strikes, of rivals lurking in contested waters. Yet the most unsettling thought was the one no one wanted to speak: that the submarine had disappeared not by accident, but by something deliberate, something that left only a fragment of communication behind. The search had not yet begun, but already the disappearance weighed heavily. In naval command centers, maps were marked with circles and arrows, each an attempt to predict where steel and men might rest. Families were told little, but wives and children knew enough to understand what silence meant. The vessel that had left the harbor under routine orders was now spoken of in hushed voices, a name whispered as if uttering it too loudly would summon bad news. And still, that final transmission lingered. A handful of words, a string of numbers, no context, no explanation. It was a riddle carved into static, the last voice of a submarine that would never be heard again. Beneath the steel skin of the submarine, far from the sunlit waters it had left behind, the crew lived within a world both claustrophobic and disciplined. The vessel itself was a paradox of power and fragility, its existence entirely dependent on the harmony of men and machinery. Within narrow passageways, lit by the pale glow of fluorescent bulbs, every step echoed with the weight of duty. The air was dry, laced with the faint scent of oil and recycled oxygen. Conversations, when they happened, were low and efficient, never straying far from necessity. Silence was not only encouraged, it was survival. Each man carried his role like a second skin. The commanding officer, hardened by years of service, bore a face that revealed little, even in the rare moments when the submarine seemed at peace. To his men, he was less a figure of personality than a fixed point, an anchor of authority in the shifting expanse of the deep. The executive officer moved with a quieter intensity, forever balancing the enforcement of rules with the subtle task of measuring morale. The navigator studied charts with a meticulous patience that bordered on obsession, as though every coordinate carried the weight of fate. The younger sailors, many on their first patrol, adapted to the rhythms of submarine life with a mix of awe and resignation. They had been trained for the routines, the drills, the endless cycles of watch rotations, yet nothing truly prepared them for the reality of confinement, the impossibility of privacy, the hum of the engines never ceasing, the knowledge that between them and crushing pressure was only a hull of steel. They found solace in repetition, in the mechanical rituals that tethered them to a sense of normalcy. Meals became markers of time, the aroma of reheated rations signaling another set of hours survived. Letters from home, tucked into lockers, were read and reread in stolen moments of solitude. Some men closed their eyes and whispered the names of children they had kissed goodbye weeks before. Others counted down the days until shore leave with quiet determination, convinced that endurance alone would see them through. They shared unspoken fears in the smallest gestures, a nod, a glance, a hand on a shoulder. The sea demanded silence, but humanity persisted in the spaces between. Even in its monotony, submarine life was never truly still. There were drills designed to replicate disaster, alarms that pierced the thick air with a jarring suddenness. Fires were imagined, flooding rehearsed, collisions simulated. Every man knew his station, his role in the choreography of survival. These exercises were performed with precision, yet behind the discipline lingered the shadow of what such events would mean if they ever occurred for real. The drills were not games. They were rehearsals for death narrowly averted. As the days pressed on, the crew moved deeper into routine, deeper into the mission's silence. The ocean outside remained unknowable, yet its presence was constant, felt in the pressure gauges, the sonar pings, the endless awareness that they were guests in a world not meant for men. The hull creaked sometimes under strain, groaning like an ancient beast adjusting its weight. Each sound was catalogued by experience, harmless flexing, harmless vibration. Yet occasionally a sound lingered too long, too sharp, and men exchanged glances that revealed what they dared not say aloud. The last transmission had not yet reached them, but already there were signs of unease. The radio operator, a man whose hands knew the patterns of coded messages by touch alone, noted small irregularities in the frequencies they monitored. Static rose and fell in strange intervals, carrying fragments of sound that did not fit expected patterns. He logged them with care, marking the time and noting his uncertainty in restrained language. Such entries were easy to overlook, yet they would later stand as the first cracks in a wall of silence. In the mess hall, laughter sometimes broke through the monotony, brief bursts of levity that reminded them they were still men, not machines. But even then the laughter was subdued, quickly swallowed by the hum of engines. Each man knew that their lives depended not only on their own vigilance, but on the vigilance of everyone around them. Trust was not optional, it was survival. To falter in duty was to place the entire vessel in jeopardy. The sea offered no margin for error. In private corners of thought, they carried their own questions about the mission. Few of them knew its full scope. Orders were compartmentalized, details revealed only to those whose tasks required it. The younger men assumed it was routine, a patrol like any other, a show of presence in contested waters. The veterans, however, sensed more. They had sailed too many times not to recognize when an operation carried unusual weight. The silence of the commanding officer, the precision of their course, the timing of their departure, all of it suggested a purpose that reached beyond routine, and yet, for all the speculation, their world remained bounded by steel and routine. They maintained the submarine with devotion. Every valve checked, every gauge noted, every system tested. They trusted the vessel to hold, the machinery to obey, the sea to remain neutral. It was a trust born not of choice but of necessity. To question it openly was to invite a weight too heavy to bear. In those quiet hours, as the submarine carved its path through black water, the crew lived their dual lives, soldiers bound by duty and men tethered to the fragile threads of home. Each carried within him the invisible burden of fear, hope, and loyalty. And somewhere beyond their hull, in the vastness they could not see, the sea waited with its unknowable secrets. The transmission that would change everything had not yet arrived, but the men were already participants in a story they could neither predict nor control. Their routines, their silences, their unseen fears would soon be marked not as details of ordinary service, but as fragments of the last chapter of a vessel that would never return. In the dim hours before dawn, while most of the world above slept, the first sign of rupture arrived. Naval command centers, operating in their perpetual cycle of monitoring and vigilance, recorded a burst of communication from the depths. It did not arrive according to schedule, nor did it follow the structure of standard reporting. Instead, it emerged abruptly, like a voice breaking through a curtain of static, insistent yet incomplete. The message carried weight not because of its length, but because of what it lacked. The transmission began with the expected recognition code, confirming its origin from the submarine. But after that, the structure dissolved. A string of numbers followed, jagged and abrupt, not fitting the format of positional coordinates or routine operational data. Then a phrase, short and unsettling in its isolation, its meaning obscured by static. After that, silence. The signal cut off as though swallowed, leaving nothing but an emptiness that the listening officers strained to fill. Attempts to raise the vessel again met only with the low hiss of an ocean, unwilling to give back what it had taken. At first, the event was filed as a probable error. Communication at sea was vulnerable to interference, storms, atmospheric anomalies, even the unpredictable nature of long-range transmission beneath water. Such irregularities were known, tolerated, and often forgotten when the next clear signal arrived. But the weight of this particular message unsettled those who read it. The numbers seemed too deliberate, the phrasing too intentional to be dismissed as noise. There was no follow-up, no correction, no attempt from the submarine to clarify. The vessel had spoken once and then fallen silent. In the operations room, officers replayed the recording. The static hissed endlessly as they slowed the reel, isolating fragments, amplifying certain tones. The phrase repeated itself, distorted but undeniable. It was not a distress call, not coded as such, yet something in its clipped form suggested urgency. Analysts debated whether it might be a fragment of a longer message, cut short by malfunction. Others speculated that the transmission had been deliberately brief, the crew constrained by circumstances not yet understood. The ambiguity was worse than any confirmed disaster. Hours passed, and with each one the silence deepened. Scheduled check-ins from the submarine did not arrive. The sea remained mute. Patrol aircraft dispatched along the expected course reported nothing unusual on the surface. Radar sweeps revealed only empty water. The submarine somewhere beneath continued its course, or had ceased to exist within its expected path. The inability to know which possibility was true became its own form of torment. The radio operator who had first received the signal found himself unable to dismiss it. He replayed it quietly in the background, listening as though repetition might unlock its meaning. The numbers began to carve themselves into his memory, each digit like a fragment of a puzzle without a frame. He compared them against navigation charts, against operational codes, against the catalogue of cipher sequences. None of them aligned cleanly. They seemed suspended between meanings, as though designed to resist easy interpretation. Meanwhile, in the submarine itself, the men had no awareness of the confusion their message had sown. Whatever circumstances had compelled the transmission were hidden from the outside world, sealed within the hull that now moved in silence. The crew carried on their routines, or perhaps they did not. The truth lay far beneath, where pressure crushed even the idea of certainty. Those on shore could only speculate, constructing theories to fill the void left by the missing signal. By evening, unease had spread through command circles. The absence of a follow-up was no longer a quirk. It was a breach of protocol. Messages were sent to Allied vessels in adjacent waters, requesting heightened awareness. Search parameters were drafted quietly, prepared for use should the silence continue. But in official communications, restraint was maintained. Families were told nothing beyond reassurances that the submarine remained on course, the truth that it had broken its silence with something cryptic and then retreated into absence was considered too volatile to share. Within the closed walls of classified meetings, however, the debate grew urgent. Some officers insisted the numbers corresponded to coordinates, though the suggested location pointed to no obvious significance. Others argued they were fragments of a systems code, a warning from within the submarine about failing equipment. A smaller, quieter faction wondered if the signal had been interrupted by external forces, an intrusion, an act that silenced communication before the crew could complete it. Each theory carried consequences too vast to accept without proof. As night fell again, the message continued to haunt those who had heard it. A vessel that should have been present only as a silent dot on navigational maps had instead spoken in riddles and disappeared into the ocean's vast indifference. The last words, fractured and incomplete, became more than an anomaly. They became a marker, a line drawn between what was known and what was feared. The sea had swallowed many ships before, but rarely had it left behind such a trace, a voice half-spoken, a puzzle without a solution. And so the waiting began, for a second message, for an explanation, for anything that would break the oppressive silence that followed. But nothing came. Only the faint recording remained, a fragment replayed in rooms of tired men staring at charts, wondering what unseen event had broken the calm. The ocean, vast and indifferent, became the stage of one of the most urgent search operations ever mounted by naval command. When hours of silence turned into days without transmission, the decision was no longer a matter of caution, but necessity. The submarine, once a silent arrow in the fleet's arsenal, was now a missing entity, its absence threatening both lives and national security. Maps were spread across command tables, lines of possibility drawn and redrawn, each calculation a desperate attempt to pin down the location of steel and men lost beneath. Search vessels were dispatched first, their sonar arrays sweeping across corridors of ocean, where the submarine was last estimated to have traveled. Aircraft followed, flying in broad arcs, their sensors dragging across the waters below. Even satellites were tasked with monitoring surface anomalies, hoping to detect oil slicks, debris, or signs of sudden rupture from beneath. The scale of the operation expanded rapidly, each hour of silence multiplying the urgency, each unanswered call tightening the weight of what might already be true. The ocean, however, resisted every intrusion. Sonar pings returned echoes that dissolved into meaningless shapes. The depths concealed rather than revealed. The pressure of the abyss, greater than any human-built machine could long withstand, held its secrets tightly. At times, operators thought they detected irregular returns, faint suggestions of a structure resting far below. Yet when they narrowed their sweeps and recalibrated their instruments, the signals faded into background noise. It was as though the sea itself erased each clue before it could be confirmed. Days into the search, a fragment of wreckage was found. It was a small piece, unidentifiable to the untrained eye, yet unmistakably part of a vessel's outer structure. It floated alone, far from any logical path, as if it had drifted deliberately into emptiness. The discovery ignited speculation, but its ambiguity only deepened the mystery. If it was from the submarine, why was there no larger field of debris? Why no evidence of catastrophic destruction? Why only this solitary fragment, untethered and unaccompanied? Analysts catalogued it, but the unanswered questions clung to it like shadows. On board the searching ships, tension grew. Crews worked in shifts around the clock, eyes fixed on screens, ears attuned to sonar, as though sheer vigilance might conjure answers. Yet the longer the search continued without resolution, the more the silence pressed down on them. In mess halls, men whispered theories in low voices. that the submarine had plunged intact to the seafloor, that it had been taken by an unseen collision, that it had slipped into the hands of rivals. None of these explanations could be dismissed, yet none could be proven. Naval Command faced its own dilemma. To continue the search indefinitely meant exposing the scale of the crisis to the world, risking speculation that could spiral into diplomatic consequences. To scale it back meant accepting that the submarine, with its men and secrets, was already gone. Neither choice was tolerable, so the search pressed on, growing wider, deeper, increasingly frantic. Ships mapped thousands of square miles of ocean, yet the void gave nothing back. In the halls of authority, meetings stretched late into the night. Charts covered tables, reports piled higher with every passing hour. The final transmission was replayed endlessly, its numbers and words dissected by intelligence officers, engineers, linguists. Some swore it concealed coordinates. Others saw it as a malfunction, the garbled product of systems failing under strain. Still others suggested it was an unfinished distress call, interrupted before its full intent could be delivered. Each interpretation offered direction, but none led to the submarine itself. Meanwhile, far from these rooms, families waited. Wives stood at windows that overlooked harbors. Children asked questions their parents could not answer. Official statements spoke of routine delays and operational silence, but those who had lived through such service knew better. Silence was not routine. It was rupture. Whispers circulated in communities where naval families lived side by side. The unanswered calls, the lack of updates, the sudden increase in patrol flights, all pointed to the same unspoken truth. Something was terribly wrong. By the end of the second week, desperation began to weigh even on the most disciplined of searchers. Fuel was consumed in vast quantities. Aircraft crews returned exhausted. Sonar operators struggled to distinguish genuine signals from illusions born of fatigue. Still, the search pressed on. Orders demanded persistence, as though sheer effort might defy the indifference of the sea. And yet, even amid this urgency, the ocean remained unchanged. Waves broke in their endless rhythm. Currents moved silently beneath. The abyss, dark and immeasurable, offered no revelation. It was as though the submarine had been erased not by accident or attack, but by absorption into the sea itself. The search would continue, expanding further, digging deeper into possibilities once dismissed. But those who had first heard the final transmission could not shake the feeling that its meaning was still out there, waiting to be understood. Somewhere beneath the surface, perhaps resting intact, perhaps scattered in fragments, the submarine remained. Its silence was not an ending, but an unanswered riddle. And the hunt had only begun. In towns scattered along the coasts, where uniforms were as common as work clothes and naval bases marked the rhythm of daily life, the silence of the submarine was felt not in charts or sonar echoes, but in the stillness of kitchens and the emptiness of beds. Families waited with an unease that grew heavier each day, their routines quietly bending under the weight of unanswered questions. For the wives, the absence was not new. Silence had long been a condition of marriage to a submariner. Patrols came with long stretches of no contact, and families learned to carry on with faith that the silence would end with a return. But this silence was different. The official statements delivered by officers at the base were steady and careful. Words chosen with precision, communication delay, routine monitoring, no confirmed incident. They were meant to reassure, but in their very precision they betrayed something missing. No one used such words when everything was fine. Children felt the shift in ways they could not articulate. They asked when their fathers would be home, when the ship would dock again, when the promised gifts would be pulled from duffel bags. Mothers answered softly, repeating the lines given to them, but their eyes betrayed the uncertainty that their voices tried to mask. Schoolyards became places of whispered speculation, as children repeated half-heard fragments of adult conversations, lost, missing, searching. The words carried weight, even when they did not fully understand them. In living rooms, photographs became both comfort and burden. Frames held images of men in uniforms, faces steady and proud, captured in moments that now felt distant. Letters tucked into drawers were reread, words of reassurance suddenly carrying the tone of farewell. The presence of these objects was sharper than their absence. Each photograph, each letter, reminded families of a voice that might never return. Rumors began to spread in the neighborhoods closest to the base. Some whispered that the submarine had been lost in foreign waters, that an accident had destroyed it instantly. Others suggested collisions, weapons tests gone wrong, or even capture by rival powers. None of these rumors came from official channels, but they thrived in the vacuum left by the silence. Families gathered in kitchens, in church halls, in waiting rooms near the base, seeking comfort in numbers, repeating the fragments they had heard, each conversation tightening the knot of uncertainty. Officers tasked with speaking to the families bore their own burdens. They were instructed to maintain composure, to reveal nothing beyond the carefully approved statements. Yet many of them, themselves veterans of sea patrols, knew what silence meant. They had felt the weight of the ocean pressing against steel, had heard the creaks of hulls under strain. They knew that when communication ended without explanation, the line between hope and loss grew unbearably thin. Still, they stood in pressed uniforms and repeated the script, their own doubts buried behind discipline. Some families sought distraction, throwing themselves into work, into community duties, into the minutiae of daily life. Others found themselves paralyzed, unable to focus on anything but the absence. Nights were the hardest, when the world outside fell quiet and there was no sound to mask the endless turning of thought. It was in those hours that hope and dread wrestled most fiercely, each refusing to yield. As the days stretched into weeks, the silence became not just a fact, but a presence. It settled over houses like fog, creeping into conversations, into meals, into the simple act of waking each morning to find nothing had changed. Families wrote letters they knew might never be read, sealed them and kept them hidden, as though words left behind could bridge the impossible gap. Churches filled with prayers, not loud or dramatic but whispered, private, folded into the quiet rituals of faith. The naval community closed ranks, supporting one another in ways both visible and unseen. Meals were cooked for those who could not bring themselves to eat. Children were watched by neighbors. Doors were left open so no one had to sit alone. Yet for all the solidarity, each family carried its own private ache, its own intimate version of the unanswered silence. In the end, what they faced was not certainty, but limbo. No confirmation of disaster, no declaration of survival, only the weight of waiting. And in that waiting, the last transmission gained a mythical presence. Though the families were never told its exact contents, word filtered out that something unusual had been received, something brief and unexplained. It became the center of speculation, a ghost of communication that carried with it both terror and hope. For if a transmission had been sent, perhaps it meant survival, a signal cut short but not extinguished. Or perhaps it was only the voice of a ship in its final moments, leaving behind a fragment to echo in the lives of those left behind. The families waited, carrying on with lives that felt suspended, their routines shadowed by the vastness of the sea. The submarine had disappeared into silence, but its absence spoke constantly in the rooms and streets it had left behind. The waiting itself became part of the story, a chapter not written in records or reports, but in the quiet endurance of those who loved men, now swallowed by the ocean's indifference. While families waited in private torment, in the hidden chambers of government, the submarine's disappearance was given a different weight. It was not only a human tragedy in the making, but a strategic rupture, a moment in which the boundaries between accident, act of war, and espionage blurred. The vessel had vanished during the most fragile years of global tension, when silence at sea could mean more than loss. It could mean confrontation, escalation, or secrets too dangerous to surface. The submarine was not a simple patrol craft. It carried technologies not yet disclosed beyond classified circles, instruments designed to listen, to measure, to intercept. Its presence in contested waters was deliberate, part of a silent game of proximity and surveillance, played by nations that could not afford open conflict. To lose it was to risk not only the lives of its crew, but the exposure of its hidden purpose. In secure rooms behind maps marked with pins and shaded zones, the question was asked not only of where it had gone, but who might now know it was gone. Intelligence officers combed through intercepted communications from rival fleets. Were they celebrating a quiet victory? Did they know something that command did not? Analysts traced unusual movements of foreign vessels, charted courses that brushed too close to the submarine's last known path. Naval attachés abroad were instructed to listen carefully, to sift through the smallest fragments of rumor. Each silence, each coded transmission intercepted, became a possible thread in the growing web of suspicion. Some believed the submarine had collided with another vessel, perhaps even a foreign submarine shadowing it in secret. The ocean was not empty. It was crowded with watchers and counter-watchers, each movement measured and answered. A collision beneath the surface, unseen and unacknowledged, could have destroyed both vessels, or left one crippled in the deep. If so, would the rival nation admit it? Or would they bury it, as command now debated burying their own uncertainty? Others suggested sabotage, a flaw planted deliberately in machinery, a device triggered by external signal, a hidden act designed not to destroy outright, but to silence. If sabotage had occurred, it meant the reach of rivals extended farther than anyone had admitted, perhaps even into the shipyards where the submarine had been built. Such possibilities made even allies subject to suspicion, and in the climate of the Cold War, suspicion was a currency more powerful than truth, and yet, there were those who argued still for accident, mechanical failure, a sudden implosion caused by the merciless pressure of the deep. Submarines had been lost before, and the ocean cared little for politics. But if it was accident, why the transmission? Why the string of numbers and the lone phrase before silence? Machines did not speak in riddles. Men under duress did. The final transmission remained the fracture point in every discussion, a piece of evidence that resisted every explanation. Within government corridors, debates turned to secrecy. How much should be told? How much could be admitted without inviting foreign exploitation? Official reports were drafted with phrases so vague they bordered on denial. Loss of communication, search ongoing, all possibilities under review. Yet within the classified annexes, the words were sharper. Probable hostile involvement, potential compromise of sensitive technology, strategic repercussions. These were words never meant to reach families, never meant to reach the public, words that weighed heavily on the men who wrote them. Naval strategy shifted quietly. Other submarines were rerouted, patrol patterns altered, surface fleets positioned with unusual care. Aircraft flew along borders not merely to search, but to signal presence. The disappearance of one vessel had become the shadow under which an entire fleet now moved. Each decision tinged with the knowledge that rivals watched as closely as they themselves did. For the men at sea, executing these new orders, the mission became less about finding the lost submarine and more about projecting that nothing had been lost at all. To appear shaken was to invite challenge. To admit uncertainty was to reveal weakness. Ships cut through contested waters with a show of purpose, as though routine had not been broken, as though silence did not carry with it the weight of secrets. Behind it all, in locked safes and sealed envelopes, the final transmission sat like a spark waiting for air. Analysts studied it again and again, searching for meanings layered beneath the obvious. Was it a cipher disguised as error? A warning meant only for those who knew what to look for? Or was it the last voice of a doomed vessel, words spoken in haste before the sea claimed it? The Cold War had long thrived on the unseen, on whispers, shadows, the unprovable acts carried out beneath the threshold of open war. Now the submarine's disappearance joined that realm, less a tragedy acknowledged than a mystery folded into the machinery of suspicion. In that world, explanations were less important than leverage, and silence was itself a weapon. The families still waited, unaware of the scale of debate their loved one's absence had ignited. To them, it remained a matter of human loss, but to those who sat in rooms where maps covered the walls and red lines stretched across oceans, the submarine was no longer just a vessel of men. It was a piece in a dangerous game, a move unseen but felt across the board. And until the ocean yielded proof, speculation would be as powerful as fact, and shadows would shape the truth more than light ever could. The search that began with urgency and expanded with fear soon descended into a different kind of pursuit. The pursuit of fragments, of evidence so incomplete that each discovery seemed less like an answer and more like another layer of the unknown. By the 7th week, the maps spread across command tables bore overlapping lines and shaded circles, vast territories charted and recharted, yet the submarine remained absent, as if swallowed by a silence more deliberate than accident. The ocean, impenetrable and unwilling, yielded only shards of possibility. Sonar operators spent endless hours bent over their consoles, ears and eyes straining against static. The ocean floor was not flat but jagged, ridged with canyons, littered with geological anomalies that mocked the instruments designed to measure them. Every echo had to be read, questioned, debated. Sometimes a return suggested a structure lying deep below, large enough to resemble a hull. Crews altered their courses, dispatched remotely operated probes, only to discover natural formations, rock spines shaped by currents, volcanic ridges that mimicked steel. Each disappointment deepened the weight of futility, yet none could abandon the task. Amid the noise, fragments did emerge. A sonar sweep picked up what appeared to be a metallic resonance, not of natural origin. The sound was sharp, unnatural, recorded carefully and sent to analysts on shore. When replayed, slowed and examined, it revealed no certainty, only the haunting possibility that something lay broken on the seabed, vibrating faintly under currents. But if it was indeed part of the missing submarine, why did no other evidence surround it? Why was the sea not littered with fragments, as catastrophe should have ensured? Alongside sonar, weather and oceanographic logs were scoured for anomalies. On the night of the final transmission, storms had passed through parts of the region, their winds capable of distorting signals. Currents shifted sharply, pulling objects hundreds of miles from their origins. Analysts overlaid these records onto maps of possible drift, calculating where debris might have surfaced. Small items were indeed found: a life vest, a torn piece of netting, twisted metal that resisted identification. Each was catalogued, but none could be irrefutably tied to the submarine. They became artifacts of uncertainty, symbols of what could not be proven. Intelligence analysts worked in parallel, examining intercepts from rival powers. Reports revealed unusual naval movements, fleets that had altered course suddenly, aircraft deployed with atypical frequency. Yet whether these were responses to the missing submarine or unrelated maneuvers could not be determined. Suspicion bred in the absence of evidence, and in the climate of the Cold War, every action was assumed to carry hidden motive. Even the vessel's own logs, transmitted before its disappearance, were revisited. Course adjustments, depth readings, fuel reports, all were reviewed for irregularities. A minor fluctuation in engine output days before the last transmission was noted, a potential sign of mechanical stress. But if that stress had grown fatal, why had the submarine sent such a cryptic signal instead of a standard distress call? The records raised questions but provided no resolution, fragments without a frame. Amid these analyses, the final transmission became both anchor and labyrinth. Its numbers were tested against navigational grids, cipher tables, even star charts. None aligned perfectly. Some analysts claimed the sequence matched the coordinates of a remote ocean trench, while others insisted they were part of an equipment code, a silent warning of internal malfunction. The phrase that followed remained an enigma, distorted by static, its meaning slipping through every attempt at interpretation. Each replay of the recording became an act of frustration, a reminder that truth was not merely hidden, but perhaps deliberately obscured. Debate fractured among the investigators. One camp argued that the submarine lay intact at the bottom, pressure having crushed communication but spared the hull, leaving it to rest silently until technology advanced enough to recover it. Another believed in catastrophic implosion, an event so sudden and absolute that little trace could rise to the surface. A third whispered of capture, of the vessel seized and hidden, its crew alive or silenced, its silence imposed rather than chosen. None of these theories could be proven, and so all coexisted uneasily, fragments of truth in a story without center. For the families, official updates grew fewer, replaced by generic assurances. But leaks filtered outward, of wreckage found, of sounds detected, of foreign fleets maneuvering nearby. Each fragment, stripped of context, became fuel for rumor. The waiting communities transformed speculation into narrative, and the missing men became both victims of the sea and pawns in a global game they had never chosen to play. As weeks stretched into months, the searches continued, but their movements became slower, more methodical, less driven by hope than by obligation. Sonar mapped mile after mile of seabed, building an archive of echoes that might one day yield clarity. Every log, every intercept, every fragment of metal was filed away, placed into boxes marked pending conclusion, yet the conclusion refused to come. The story of the submarine became not one of discovery, but of accumulation, an endless gathering of fragments that only made the absence more profound. In the end, the sea remained what it always had been, a keeper of secrets. The fragments scattered across charts and reports were not answers, but reminders of how little could be known, how much remained unseen. And so the narrative of the missing submarine grew not from certainty but from absence, a puzzle of broken pieces that could not be assembled. The final transmission lingered at its center, an echo no analysis could silence, a voice reaching out from the abyss and then withdrawing forever. With time, absence ceased to be merely a condition. It became fertile ground. Where official reports spoke in silence and fragments, theories rose to fill the void, multiplying until they seemed as inevitable as the ocean itself. The disappearance of the submarine no longer belonged solely to the sea. It belonged also to the realm of speculation, where fact and conjecture interwove into narratives that refused to quiet. The first and most persistent theory was mechanical failure. Engineers pointed to the small irregularities in earlier engine logs, the possibility of a coolant leak, the chance that a minor defect had grown catastrophic under pressure. In this version of events, the submarine had descended deeper than intended. Its hull strained until it collapsed in an implosion so violent it left little trace. Advocates of this theory pointed to physics. Steel could only withstand so much. Yet others countered with a single, immovable question. If it was sudden implosion, why the transmission? No machine error explained the deliberate burst of numbers and words. No accidental failure spoke in riddles before vanishing. The second theory leaned toward collision. The Cold War seas were never empty. Beneath their surface moved fleets unseen, rivals shadowing rivals, each patrol a dance of pursuit and evasion. A collision with another submarine, domestic or foreign, could explain both the abrupt silence and the absence of wreckage spread across the surface. Perhaps both vessels had been destroyed, their fragments swallowed by the abyss. Or perhaps only one had survived, leaving the other to rest unmarked on the seabed. Those who supported this theory whispered of intercepted signals from foreign fleets, movements that suggested damage control disguised as routine maneuvers. Yet no nation admitted loss, and silence on both sides only deepened suspicion. A third theory spoke of sabotage. It suggested that the submarine had been compromised long before it left harbor, a flaw introduced deliberately into its systems, waiting for the moment it would fail. In this telling, the final transmission was not a malfunction, but a desperate attempt to warn, cut short by forces inside or outside the vessel. If sabotage was true, it meant rival hands had reached into the very heart of shipbuilding, embedding destruction within steel. For officials, this theory was the most dangerous, for it implied vulnerability not only in one vessel, but across the fleet. Still, in the secrecy of classified briefings, the word sabotage was whispered with uneasy frequency. And then came the more unsettling theories, ones less grounded in technical explanation and more in the darker undercurrents of strategy. Some believed the submarine had not been lost at all, but seized, captured in deep waters, towed or forced into foreign harbors, its crew imprisoned, its technology dismantled in secrecy. If this was true, it meant the silence was not death but concealment, a vanishing orchestrated by human intent rather than nature's indifference. This theory gained traction in the absence of wreckage, its persistence fueled by the Cold War's climate of suspicion, where the line between fact and fiction was blurred by necessity. Outside the realm of military debate, the families crafted their own explanations, each shaped by grief and the need for meaning. Some clung to the hope of survival, believing their loved ones were alive somewhere, awaiting a chance to return. Others, hardened by silence, accepted loss, but needed to believe it had been swift, merciful, unaccompanied by suffering. In living rooms and kitchens, theories became coping mechanisms, ways to wrest control from the unanswerable. Public speculation, though never officially invited, began to leak into newspapers. Phrases like unexplained loss and classified circumstances fueled the imagination of readers. Writers filled columns with possibilities, some grounded in knowledge of naval operations, others drifting into sensational claims. The missing submarine became more than a military secret. It became a story told in whispers, each retelling bending it further from truth. Within command, the proliferation of theories posed its own threat. Each explanation demanded a different response: repair protocols for mechanical failure, new patrol strategies for collision, internal investigations for sabotage, diplomatic maneuvers for capture. To choose one path prematurely was to risk being wrong, yet to remain indecisive was to appear paralyzed. And so the official stance remained fixed: investigation ongoing. Behind closed doors, however, the debates grew sharper, each theory defended with urgency, each dismissal carrying the weight of potential disaster. What united all theories was a single stubborn obstacle: the last transmission. Its existence refused silence. Whatever else could be argued, that burst of numbers and words stood like a monument in the middle of every theory, pointing in all directions at once. It was evidence too clear to ignore and too ambiguous to solve. Analysts who had listened to it daily began to hear patterns where none existed, convinced that meaning was hidden in tone, in rhythm, in the static itself. Theories did not only rise from evidence, they rose from desperation to give the evidence form. And so the submarine lived on, not in steel or movement, but in the refusal of silence. It became both tragedy and myth, a story that demanded explanation even as none could be proven. Theories multiplied, fueled by fragments, by rumors, by fear, by hope. And as each grew louder, the truth, if it still lay somewhere in the deep, remained untouched, waiting, hidden beneath the weight of all the voices that tried to claim it. It was nearly a year after the submarine's final transmission when the breakthrough came. Though to call it a breakthrough was itself a kind of misdirection. The ocean gave nothing freely. It allowed only glimpses, fragments of its secrets offered in exchange for relentless persistence. The search had long since shifted from rescue to recovery, from hope of survivors to the pursuit of evidence. And yet, even in its altered form, the search pressed on, an obligation bound to both the men lost and the questions that refused silence. The discovery came from the depths, so deep that human divers could not hope to reach it. Sonar surveys had mapped the seabed with patient precision, drawing images from echoes. Most returns had been dismissed as geological formations, but one area, far from where most analysts had predicted the submarine's course, revealed anomalies that resisted easy explanation. The echoes suggested a large structure broken into segments, the angles too precise to be natural. Remote submersibles were dispatched, descending into the crushing dark with their cameras and sensors. What they revealed was haunting. Resting in silence across the silt lay twisted sections of steel, their shapes distorted by pressure but unmistakably artificial. A torn piece of hull plating, fractured at its edges as though ripped by immense force, bore markings that confirmed what no one had wanted to accept. The submarine had been found, or rather what remained of it. The wreckage was scattered across a wide area, suggesting not a simple descent, but a violent break apart under pressure. Sections of the vessel were identifiable, the conning tower partially intact, a portion of the stern lying at an unnatural angle, compartments collapsed into themselves like paper. No human remains could be recovered at such depth, but the scale of destruction spoke its own truth. The crew had not survived, and yet the discovery raised more questions than it answered. The wreckage lay far from the submarine's last reported course, as though it had deviated deliberately or been forced from its path. The breaks in the hull were inconsistent with a simple implosion. Some sections bore marks resembling external damage, gouges and tears that analysts struggled to categorize. Was it collision? Detonation? Structural failure amplified by pressure? Each possibility remained, none definitive. The final transmission returned immediately to the center of debate. If the submarine had been lost to implosion, why the coded numbers and the phrase that followed? If it had been collision, why had the rival vessels detected in nearby waters not revealed their own damage or losses? If sabotage, how had the crew managed to send even a fragmentary signal before silence claimed them? The wreckage gave shape to the mystery, but it did not resolve it. It only made the questions sharper, heavier, more urgent. Families were informed with a language carefully chosen. The submarine had been located, its loss confirmed. Words like wreckage, implosion, and irrecoverable were withheld, deemed too harsh, too final for those still clinging to fragments of hope. In private, Some families felt relief in the confirmation, however bitter, that their waiting had an end. Others felt only betrayal, convinced that the truth was still being softened, edited, restrained. The absence of clear explanation only deepened their grief. Within command, the discovery became classified almost as quickly as it was confirmed. Photographs of the wreckage, grainy and distorted by the deep, were sealed. Reports were written, stamped, locked away in archives. To admit the full details would be to reveal not only the loss but the uncertainty that still surrounded it. And in the world of the Cold War, uncertainty was itself a vulnerability. The wreck rested in silence, its presence both a conclusion and a beginning. For some, it marked the end of the search, the closure of a chapter. For others, it was only the opening of a new layer of questions. Why had the submarine deviated from its path? Why had its final transmission been so incomplete? Why did the wreckage suggest forces beyond simple failure? The ocean had surrendered a body, but not the truth of its death. Even as the wreckage was documented, plans were drawn for how little of it could ever be recovered. The depth was too great, the cost too immense, the risks too high. What had been found would remain where it lay, sealed by water and pressure, accessible only to machines. The submarine would rest in darkness, its secrets locked away by both nature and policy. For the families, the news arrived in ceremonies of folded flags and solemn words, rituals meant to frame the loss in dignity. For the strategists, it arrived as data, incomplete and frustrating, a puzzle still missing its most vital pieces. And for the ocean, it was nothing at all, only another addition to the countless wrecks that littered its floor, forgotten except by those who carried their stories. The discovery in the deep did not silence the theories. It gave them new fuel. To some, the wreck confirmed implosion. To others, it whispered of collision, of sabotage, of forces unacknowledged. Theories thrived precisely because the discovery was incomplete. The ocean had revealed enough to end denial, but not enough to end debate. And so the submarine remained both found and unfound, both explained and unexplained, its story fractured like its hull across the seabed. The last transmission still echoed above it, unanswered, untranslatable, a voice suspended in the silence of the deep. The discovery of the wreck might have seemed, to those far removed from its shadows, like the conclusion of a story. But in the halls where uniforms gathered around sealed documents, the discovery was only the beginning of another task: to transform fragments into narrative, uncertainty into report, mystery into official conclusion. It was a process less about uncovering truth than about producing something that could be spoken aloud, something that would serve both families and the state without unraveling into chaos. The investigation convened in secrecy. Engineers, naval officers, intelligence analysts, and political advisors were brought into the same room, each carrying different priorities. Engineers wanted precision, a cause grounded in the mechanics of steel and pressure. Intelligence officers sought signs of foreign involvement, eager to confirm suspicions that had simmered since the first hours of silence. Political advisors pressed for clarity, not for the sake of truth, but for the necessity of stability. Each voice pulled the wreckage in a different direction, until the story itself seemed to fracture as much as the submarine's hull. Reports were drafted, redrafted, revised again. One version concluded mechanical failure, an implosion caused by structural weakness, exacerbated by depth and oceanic pressure. Another leaned toward collision, citing unexplained marks on the hull sections recovered in images. The third entertained sabotage, but treated it as speculation, a possibility too dangerous to state outright yet too stubborn to exclude entirely. Each draft was weighed not only for accuracy, but for consequence. Words could ignite suspicion, invite confrontation, or stir unrest among those already waiting for closure. In the end, the official report spoke in language deliberately cautious. It confirmed the wreck's location, acknowledged loss of life, and attributed the cause to probable mechanical failure under extreme conditions. The phrase was carefully chosen. Probable allowed doubt to linger. Mechanical failure avoided accusations. Extreme conditions shifted blame from man or nation to the vast indifference of the sea. It was a report designed less to reveal than to contain. But behind this sanitized version lay annexes, classified sections never meant for public release. These annexes catalogued anomalies, contradictions and possibilities that resisted resolution. They noted the unusual coordinates implied by the final transmission, far from the wreck's resting place. They described external marks on the hull that could not be conclusively identified. They acknowledged intercepted signals from rival vessels operating unusually close to the submarine's last known course, and they admitted in blunt terms that none of these contradictions could be resolved. The report could be closed administratively, but never completely. Families received their closure in ceremonies where flags were folded and words spoken with solemn weight. Officials read from the report, reciting mechanical failure, as though repetition might transform uncertainty into fact. Many families accepted it quietly, grateful for any explanation, however thin. Others left the ceremonies convinced that the truth had been buried with the men, that the report was a mask, hiding what officials feared to reveal. Their doubts lingered in living rooms, in whispered conversations, in the glances exchanged between those who had lived too long with silence to believe it could be filled so neatly. For the men who had compiled the report, the weight of its contradictions remained. Some carried quiet guilt, knowing they had signed their names to conclusions that did not satisfy their own doubts. Others embraced the ambiguity as necessity, convinced that the stability of a nation demanded the suppression of inconvenient questions. And a few, engineers, analysts, officers, kept copies of the annexes in private files, unable to surrender the mystery entirely, unwilling to let it dissolve into bureaucracy. The submarine itself remained on the ocean floor, unvisited except by the machines that had first captured its image. Technology of the time could not recover it, and perhaps technology of the future would not be permitted to. The wreck became both grave and archive, holding within its broken steel whatever answers remained. Yet as long as the wreck was inaccessible, the unanswered questions could not be silenced. Years passed, but the report never truly closed. Its official version was cited in speeches, in textbooks, in training manuals. Its classified annexes, however, remained alive in the corridors of power, resurfacing whenever another submarine was lost, whenever suspicion of rivals flared, whenever silence at sea reminded those in command of how fragile certainty could be. The report became both conclusion and beginning, a document that settled nothing but served its purpose, to transform the unbearable into the manageable, the unexplainable into the administratively explained. And always at its center, the final transmission endured. It was included in the annexes, noted in technical detail but unresolved in meaning. It stood like a voice frozen in time, a reminder that even as reports were written and ceremonies conducted, something had been spoken from the depths and never answered. In its brevity, in its brokenness, it refused to conform to the neat closure the report demanded. The submarine had been lost, the men declared dead, the wreck charted on secret maps. Yet the story remained unsettled, its official ending shadowed by contradictions too stubborn to erase. The report bore the title, Final Investigation, but those who read beyond its surface understood the truth. It was not final, not closed, not complete. It was an attempt, and like the transmission itself, it ended not with certainty but with silence. Years slipped by, but the silence of the submarine never fully dissolved. It lingered, not only in the memories of families and the archives of Naval Command, but in the collective imagination of a nation caught between history and mystery. The ocean had claimed countless ships across centuries, yet this loss endured with peculiar weight. It was not only the scale of absence that gave it such gravity, but the unresolved nature of its end. The transmission that spoke without explanation, the wreck that revealed without clarifying. In the coastal towns where the crew had lived, memorials rose in granite and bronze. Names were carved into stone, etched not with the circumstances of their death but with the simplicity of remembrance. Families gathered annually to place wreaths, to stand in silence, to listen to speeches that balanced reverence with restraint. These gatherings were moments of unity, yet also of fracture. For while the names were fixed in permanence, the story behind them remained fluid, shifting with every whisper of speculation that refused to die. Among naval officers, the loss became both cautionary tale and quiet obsession. Cadets learned of it as a lesson in humility, a reminder that even the most advanced engineering could be humbled by the sea. Yet within the ranks, especially among those with access to the annexes of the investigation, the story was kept alive not as a closed chapter, but as an unsolved puzzle. Theories persisted in hushed conversations between colleagues, in notes scribbled into margins of training manuals, in the private files that officers carried with them from post to post. The submarine was less a relic of the past than a haunting presence, invoked whenever silence fell heavier than it should. For the families, time dulled, but did not erase. Children grew into adults carrying only faint memories of the men they had lost, memories sharpened more by stories told than by experiences lived. Wives aged into widows who measured years not in seasons, but in the anniversaries of absence. For some, the memorials became rituals of closure. For others, they were reminders of how little had ever been explained. The final transmission, though never revealed in its entirety to the public, reached them in fragments carried by rumor, by slips of tongue, by quiet disclosures made by those who had once worked close to the case. Each family interpreted it differently, some as a cry for help, others as a final farewell, others still as a code that remained unbroken. Beyond the immediate circle of grief and command, the story of the submarine began to drift into wider waters. Journalists denied access to classified annexes, wrote speculative pieces that leaned heavily on what was missing rather than what was known. Historians debated the disappearance as emblematic of Cold War opacity, a moment where truth had been deliberately sacrificed to the demands of strategy. Enthusiasts pored over declassified fragments, building their own reconstructions in books and forums, convinced that persistence might one day reveal what the sea and state had conspired to keep hidden. And through it all, the last transmission endured as the heart of the enigma. It was replayed in secure rooms, studied by generations of analysts who arrived with fresh eyes, but left with the same conclusion. It could not be explained. The numbers defied alignment with coordinates or codes. The phrase that followed remained distorted, interpretable in multiple ways but never decisively. Some believed meaning was lost in static, that the true message had been swallowed mid-sentence. Others suspected the opposite, that the ambiguity was intentional, a message crafted to resist interpretation. Whatever the truth, the recording became less a piece of evidence than an artifact, a relic that embodied the silence of the sea itself. In time, the wreck was revisited by newer technologies, submersibles capable of greater depth, cameras sharper, sensors more precise. Images captured decades after the loss revealed the same broken steel, the same collapsed compartments, the same silence. No hidden truth emerged, no revelation buried in silt. The wreck remained as it had been, a monument of absence resting beyond the reach of certainty. The ocean, indifferent to the questions imposed upon it, held its silence intact, and so the submarine passed into history not as a resolved story, but as an echo. Its disappearance became part of the fabric of naval memory, a reminder of the limits of knowledge and the fragility of men who ventured into depths where certainty could not follow. For every explanation offered, a contradiction remained. For every theory advanced, a flaw appeared. What endured was not a single truth, but the persistence of the unexplained, the refusal of silence to be silenced, even now, in the archives where the annexes lie sealed, in the coastal towns where memorial stones weather beneath salt air, in the minds of those who study the Cold War's hidden corners, the submarine lives on, not in movement, not in presence, but in the unresolved echo of its final words. A voice half heard, broken by static, spoken once into the abyss and never answered. A reminder that some mysteries remain, not because they cannot be solved, but because the ocean itself chooses not to yield them.